Alright, it's time to start a new unit, and that is Unit 5. And Unit 5 covers the early republic, which means about the first, say, 30 to 40 years of the United States. And Unit 5 actually has two parts. So our first section here is Unit 5, the early republic precedents. And I don't mean presidents, precedents. We'll talk about what that word means. Or, as Pink might say, we're the U.S., so we better get this party started. Alright, let's do it then. So let's start with Lesson 21 about President Washington. So our teaks, you see we do have quite a few here. So let's look at a few of the main ones here. We can identify the early republic. We can talk about how these early republic leaders handled major problems. We can summarize arguments about the early republic's economy and overprotective tariffs, which we'll discuss what that is, and the national bank. That we can explain why the new nation developed a free enterprise system. That's another one we need to talk about. That we can look at the founding fathers as models of civic virtue. And by civic virtue, we mean when they put the needs of the country and the fellow citizens over their own personal needs. And we can analyze the leadership qualities of President Washington and the contributions of Alexander Hamilton. Alright, so it's April 30th, 1789. Like we talked about in Unit 4, the Constitution required 9 states to ratify it to become legal and to become the official government of the U.S. So after that happened, they held the first presidential election in which George Washington was elected president, and John Adams came in second, which made him under the Constitution then the vice president. That has since changed. So George Washington and John Adams are inaugurated as the president and vice president. A great responsibility. Now you're familiar from English class and from your knowledge of the language that the prefix pre means to come before. So when we talk about this word precedent, this is a new vocabulary word, guys. A precedent is a first event or an action that sets an example for others to follow. An example of a precedent you might be familiar with is, say, a family tradition. Somebody does something, and then from that point on, that becomes sort of a set pattern or a tradition in that family. Well, precedents mean that you are doing something for the first time and that you expect others to use that as the following example. So President Washington knew that as the first president of a very different type of government, that his actions would set precedents for the future presidents. Let's don't get those two words confused. Precedents for the presidents. And this meant that he had to act wisely and carefully and choose his actions carefully because, again, he was setting up examples that later presidents would follow. For example, what would people call the president? Now, John Adams suggested His Highness or His Excellency, and he was thinking more along the lines of European nobles and royalty. But after a month, George Washington chose the title Mr. President. So we see, well, there we go. Yeah, we see the crown fade from his head. No crowns over here, no royal families, just Mr. President. So the precedent set here is that government officials had to be humble, had to show humility in office. Now the challenges for the Republic, and when you do your notes on this, I'd like you to set this up as a circle map. So in the middle of your circle map, you can put a flag, or you can simply write the early Republic or the U.S., and then set these items up around it as a circle map. So the challenges that they had, one was to establish a strong government, because we've talked about the problems under the Articles of Confederation. The other was to set up courts, because there was no national court system. Of course, to try to build an economy, because the United States needed to build cash reserves and to build a strong economy to last as a nation. That they needed to manage their western lands and figure out how they were going to settle those. And of course that they had to provide for national defense, because at this time there was no standing army and navy. So pause the video here for a moment, set up your circle map, and then we'll continue. So the first challenge, establishing a government. They needed officials to run government departments. So the precedent was the creation of the president's cabinet. And no, not this kind of cabinet. Nope, not at all. Not that one. But this one. In this case, the cabinet means a group of appointed advisors who manage the government departments. Now, the first cabinet had 5 members who we'll meet here in just a moment. The modern presidential cabinet has been expanded to 15. In this picture, we see President Barack Obama meeting with his cabinet officials. Now, these cabinet officials, just like federal judges, must be appointed by the president and then confirmed by the Senate. So our first cabinet was made up of the Secretary of the Treasury, who's in charge of the economy, and the first one was Alexander Hamilton, who we'll get to know pretty well in this segment here. He was a Federalist. Then we have the Secretary of State, who handles foreign relations. That was Thomas Jefferson. Now you see, Hamilton and Jefferson were not part of the same group. Jefferson was not a Federalist. Then we have Secretary of War, who handles the military and defense, and that was Henry Knox, who was one of Washington's generals during the Revolutionary War. And then Attorney General, who enforces the laws. This is sort of like the country's chief lawyer, who's in charge of prosecuting lawbreakers. Our first one was Edmund Randolph. Then you have the Postmaster General, who was in charge of setting up the mail, but also in charge of building roads. And that was Samuel Osgood. Of these five, Postmaster General, the post office has gone private, so Postmaster General is no longer part of the cabinet. But all of these other four still are. Next came creating the courts, because as we said, the U.S. had no standing federal courts, and Constitution only established the Supreme Court, and the other courts are left to Congress to handle and to create. So the Judiciary Act of 1789, and judiciary, by the way, is another word for the judicial branch. So the Judiciary Act of 1789 established 6 justices on the Supreme Court. Of course, now we have 9, and it created a number of lower federal courts. Now, the state courts also kept their powers, but it also said that federal courts are superior, which means over the state courts, which is consistent with Article 6, the Supremacy Clause, which we talked about in our last unit. And the first Chief Justice, which is the head judge of the Supreme Court, was John Jay. And of course, there was the need to build the economy. For one thing, the state and national governments had borrowed millions of dollars from foreign countries and merchants in order to pay for the Revolutionary War, which added up to over $52 million in debt, which is still a lot of money today, but back then it was a really lot of money. And like we mentioned, the structure of the Articles of Confederation, with each state acting kind of like a little mini country, you had both state and national foreign debt. So the need to repay these debts was pretty important. The U.S. needed to earn the world's respect and justify itself as a reliable business partner for other countries to do business here. So Treasury Secretary Hamilton believed that industry, which means manufacturing and factories, and not agriculture, which is farming, would be the best way to build the U.S. economy. So he set about ways to increasing and building industry in the U.S. So his economic plan. Step 1 was to pay war debts. That all of the state debts would be taken over and rolled together into one complete federal debt. Now, the southern states didn't like this idea because many of them had gone farther toward paying off their foreign debts, and they owed less money than the northern states. So essentially, the southern states were being asked to take on the debt of the northern states. So they debated this a little while, and of course they came to a compromise, which they always seem to be able to do then. And that is that the South agreed if the U.S. would place its new capital in their area, in the territory. So they chose Washington, D.C., and they placed it between the states of Virginia and Maryland. Step 2 would be a federal tariff. And we've talked about tariffs somewhat before, but tariffs we're going to see are going to be more important as we go forward in talking about during the 1800s. Now, perhaps as a review, a tariff is a tax on imported goods, goods that come into the country. The way tariffs work is, let's say, for example, that we have American cloth, which costs $4 a roll to make, and we have British cloth that is competing in American markets. It also costs $4 to make. But as it's being shipped here, before it is taken in on or imported into the United States on American soil, it is added a 25% tariff, which is going to add $1 to its price. So when they're actually sold in stores over here, the American cloth costs $4, the British cloth costs $5, and the idea is to encourage people to buy the American cloth instead. So the goal of this tariff was to encourage American industry by making foreign goods more expensive. This is also called a protective tariff because it protects domestic businesses. And his third step was a national bank. He asked Congress to create a national bank for a number of reasons. First of all, it would be a safe place to keep the nation's money. That a national bank would be able to loan money to businesses to encourage industry. We talked about that being an important part of Hamilton's plan. And finally, that they can issue paper money that people could depend on, because we saw during the Confederation era what happens when people lose their faith in paper money. And as we see in this diagram here, a bank is an important part of what's called the business cycle. So the business cycle, we're going to go ahead and start here with the people, which means the workers. When people do their job, they're given paychecks. Most of that money goes to things that they need, food, clothing, and shelter. But hopefully they will have some savings left over, and that money is deposited in the bank. Banks then use that money as the next part of the cycle to loan money to individuals, but also to businesses, so that businesses can fulfill their orders and hopefully grow. Businesses take that money, they invest it in new products, they hire more workers, they pay wages, and so the idea is as these businesses grow, they will hire more workers and pay them better, which is going to result in an increase in salaries, more money to the bank, more money to loan, and so on and so on. This is why this is called the business cycle, is that it should feed itself if it's running properly. So we're going to stop here at the end of lesson 21 with our thoughts. What unique challenges faced George Washington when he became the first U.S. president? Number 2, how did Alexander Hamilton view the role of government in building the U.S. economy? And number 3, what personal qualities made George Washington a good choice to lead the early republic? So think about that idea of civic virtue. Why do you think George Washington was a good choice for the first president? And our next lesson 22 will be on political parties.